Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Harris. I'm honored to serve as the Associate Dean of Clinical and Experiential Programs at UDC Law. I also direct our Immigration and Human Rights Clinic. I have my Earth Day frame up today, just as a reminder for everybody to get outside and appreciate nature and Earth today if you can, after this Zoom session. This is our third and final for this semester Conversation with Clinicians event. This is UDC clinicians engaging in conversations with leaders in the experiential education field. Our school in particular as leaders in early clinical education, and where our day students still take 2 mandatory clinics to graduate. We have a special 10-credit clinic for our evening students now. We wanted to create a space where clinicians across the country and indeed the world can engage in topics of interest, kind of thinking through some of the most pressing issues facing our community. So that's certainly what we are doing today. And I'm thrilled to introduce UDC Law's General Practice Clinic co-director, Tianna Gibbs, who will be in conversation with Norrinda Hayat. Both of these women have been friends to me on the tenure track at UDC Law at various times. Norrinda joined in 2015, a year before me, Tianna just a year after me. So I know that so many of us have tremendous respect for these two women and can't wait to hear them unpack this important topic. I'm not going to share all of the details of their bios, but just very briefly for those of you who aren't acquainted with Tianna and Norrinda, Professors Gibbs and Hayat. So Tianna is, as I said, co-director of UDC Law's General Practice Clinic with Andy Budzinski, who's also here today. She's a beloved UDC Law professor, and she teaches in both our day and evening program as a clinician, but also teaches a wide range of other courses, including Civil Procedure 1 and 2, negotiations, moot court. Earlier this year, you may have seen that she received the Society of American Law Teachers Junior Faculty Award. She came to UDC after almost a decade of practice at DC Legal Aid, where she handled DV cases, domestic violence and family law cases, engaged in systemic reform in those areas. She continues to do so, and in those areas in clinical practice. And her scholarship examines the intersection between race, gender, poverty, and access to justice. Norrinda or Tianna, if you guys want to admit people, that would help me out.
Okay.
That thrilled to teach with Professor Gibbs, and also to have taught in the past with Professor Hayat. So Norrinda is currently an associate professor of law with tenure at Rutgers Law School, and she directs the Civil Justice Clinic. She also teaches courses in property law, critical race theory, and landlord-tenant law. And her scholarship focuses in some similar ways with Tianna's on the intersection of race, gender, and access to housing. So we're going to hear a lot more about Norrinda's path to clinical teaching and work today. And so I'm going to hand it over to Tianna to kick off this conversation. I will say, for the purposes of this discussion, you're welcome to stay on screen and keep your video on or off. The recording will just reflect who's speaking at the time, so you don't have to worry about being captured in perpetuity on UDC Law's website. So up to you as you would like to appear on video or not on video. So without further ado, thank you, Professor Gibbs and Professor Hayat, for being here, and I'll hand it over to you, Tianna.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for that gracious introduction. Hello, everyone. Happy Friday afternoon. As Lindsay said, I'm Tianna Gibbs. I co-direct the General Practice Clinic at UDC, and I'm really excited about this conversation with Professor Norrinda Hayat. She is my dear friend, former UDC colleague, and she's been a mentor to me. I think of Norrinda as my big sister in academia, and I'm just thrilled to have this opportunity to connect with her about her thinking and her work. And I'm excited about this topic that we're discussing today, how to teach anti-racist clinics. Our conversation will focus on Norrinda's recent essay in Clinical Law Review, and the title of that is Freedom Pedagogy Toward Teaching Anti-Racist Clinics. So first I want to welcome Norrinda to UDC's Conversations with Clinicians. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Tianna. There's so many warm feelings for me in this Zoom room, for me to you all. I'm really glad to see these familiar faces and be in conversation today, obviously with Tianna. And thank you, Lindsay, for both setting up this program generally and inviting me to be a part of it. I appreciate it.
Great. So before we start the conversation, I want to give you a sense of how we'll spend our time together today. So the conversation will proceed in two segments. The first segment will be Norrinda and I in conversation. I'll ask Norrinda a series of questions about her work. She will gift us with her immense wisdom. And then I will open the floor for questions from the audience. At around 1:15, we'll open the floor. So during that second segment, please feel free to unmute yourselves, ask a question, or type it in the chat, whatever you prefer. So let's dive in. I want to start by letting Norrinda give us a bit of insight about her path to clinical teaching. And Norrinda and I had a similar path in that I know Norrinda entered clinical teaching directly from practice outside of academia without having a fellowship. That was also my path. And I think Norrinda is our first guest on this series to have taken that path. And others on the call may be considering a similar path. So Norrinda, it would be great to hear the why of making that transition from practice to teaching. Why did you do it and how did you do it?
Yeah, I don't know that this is where the wisdom, any wisdom that I have to impart is not in the answer to this question. It was a lack of understanding of the process that really led me to apply without a fellowship. And, I don't know that I realized the fellowship was, required at the time. So, I don't know if that's advice I would give. And I do think the market has even shifted since I got into it.
Right.
And so, I think people should strike while it's hot. If you can get a thing that is interesting to you, because for me, continuing housing work was really important to me. There aren't many housing, at least at that time, though we're in a new moment with respect to the housing law market. But at that time, there were very few exclusively housing dedicated clinics in the country. And even now, there still are very few. I've directed, two of,
Right.
of the maybe handful already.
A large fraction,
so,
yeah.
Right. I think that if you're in a niche field, and where would you be a fellow, right? Like what was going to change if I go to a non-housing clinic fellowship or non-housing focused fellowship? I'm not sure that would have helped me any. And losing the opportunity to be in a housing clinic when it was available would not have been to me the best option. So I guess I'm just saying you have to go with the flow, right? In CRIM, I think differently. My partners in CRIM, there's a ton of CRIM clinics. It's very competitive. There are more opportunities. And so I don't know, you hurt yourself, and there's the pretty men, right? You have a pathway that's built out to do that. So I would say that depending on what your area is, maybe a fellowship will help more or not. But I didn't know who there was to study under really, that would have made it any more likely that I get a job because of how niche my area is.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. And it would be great just to share some of those early day transition sort of insights that you've gained of how did you acclimate yourself to this clinical space, particularly the pedagogy of teaching in a clinic? How did you do that early on?
So I think what is something to also consider is where I've built my clinics and the strength of the programs in which I have been able to build not one but two housing clinics. So Shelley Broderick, who was dean at the time, was gracious enough to send me, like the first thing that I did almost as a clinician was go to Palm Springs for the ALS clinical conference when it was out there. And so prior to day one, day zero, I spent 4 or 5 days out just doing with Shelley. Like, I don't know who else was there. Shelley might have been the only person I really knew at the conference for real. And one other colleague who had left the department earlier than me. So she both introduced me to a lot of people in the clinical community there, but I spent all those days knowing nothing about, like, having no socializing to do since I didn't know anyone, really just going to workshops from morning to night, thinking about the pedagogical, questions and choices to be made in the clinic. So, that was May. I didn't start until July. That gave me a few months to just, read and think about how to teach. I mean, I was telling a friend on the way here, I come from two teachers, and I used to like think about teaching a lot. They don't teach law school, so, that is something, but my husband's a teacher. He taught high school, he teaches law as well. And so I think we think about teaching in my house and in my family a lot. And I think that's been valuable insight, even if not directly applicable in terms of the, genre. But so I would say early introduction through the clinical conference was really invaluable to me. I'm still a big believer in the clinical conference. I sit on the committee right now to plan the next, which will be in person, over, like, unless I'm not on this earth, this conference will be in person, because I believe so strongly in the value of both our networking at that conference, but our teaching each other and teaching new clinicians how to be good teachers. I believe in that.
No, I remember going to my first clinical conference. I didn't go until I was a year in, and just blown away by what I learned and the people I met, and really energized and equipped in that space. So I completely agree with you, and I'm hoping with you that we can return to in-person soon.
No, it is my goal in sitting on the committee is to get us back in person, as I know others want to be in person again.
Yeah. So you talked about building 2 housing clinics and kind of reference the work that you're doing now at Rutgers. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What are you doing in your clinic? What are you focusing on?
So, again, as I referenced, the landscape has changed, thankfully, and it almost feels very full circle to me. I came from the department, which we maybe didn't mention. I came from Justice Department in the housing section to UDC. And at the time I was in the department, no one would have uttered the word eviction, right? It just wasn't something that was on the radar of the federal government. Now, I say fast forward 8 years later, 7 years later, the department has expended a great deal, as has the White House and HUD, a great deal of resources on eviction, and not only eviction defense, anti-eviction programming, including the emergency rental assistance program, and for much of the pandemic, the moratoria, but also urged state and local governments, and importantly, law schools, to get into this fight to prevent the eviction of affected families. And so that changed really everything. Historically, I had done half landlord tenant because, I think law schools like it. Students are able to be guaranteed to get in court. And so if you have this as one of your civil litigation clinics, you want students to be able to get in court. And I do have fair housing work, which I think allows for rich writing and just the kind of practice that I grew up on at the department, which I think is worth sharing with the students, because L&T court is such a wild beast that best practices are not engaged in there. And I feel very uncomfortable with leaving my students with that as some model of what they should attain. So I've done half and half. I got $1 million grant from the state of New Jersey.
It's amazing. Congratulations.
Still, thank you. I mean, it was a windfall, right? Just in this environment, I had to do nothing but just continue to do what we were doing. But that allowed me to build capacity. And I brought on someone who had covered for me in my writing leave, an alum who was really deeply involved in housing work on the ground in Newark, from Newark. was a Rutgers alum, and he, Victor Monterosa, is just an amazing housing attorney. So he came into the clinic full time to help build capacity. I also hired another person to help build capacity, hired some student fellows with that money, built out a connection with North Water Coalition, which is a grassroots organization in the city. And we were able to share in kind. They do water and food distribution. So we are supporting those water and food distributions financially to take some burden off of them, while they also support us being in part of their group on the weekends, and doing Know Your Rights, which I had not historically done. I don't really like to do Know Your Rights with 3L students. Time is of the essence in terms of legal work for them. So our pro bono students, 2Ls, can't practice in court in New Jersey. So our 1L and 2L pro bono students have been doing the Know Your Rights work on the ground with North Water Coalition on Saturdays at their food and water distribution sites.
That's great.
So that's the work that we still have fair housing work, but we just ramped up the amount and type of L&T work we do. And I want to say I'm really focused on public housing right now. I think it's low-hanging fruit. And so in Newark, the largest landlord is the Housing Authority. The largest evictor is the Housing Authority. This doesn't make sense because you can adjust people's income for what they make. The money is there. The federal government has it. But there are poor practices on the side of the landlord bar. So they are pushing for evicting, even though there's no real need to evict anyone who has a subsidy, especially right now. So we focused a lot of our attention on preventing people who are in public housing from being evicted, which I think is the worst case scenario right now.
Right, because those tenants lose their subsidy, right? It's not just about losing that individual housing unit, it's about the subsidy altogether. So great, important work that you're doing in your clinic. And this kind of tees up the article that you wrote in Clinical Law Review related to anti-racist clinical pedagogy, because it's with that backdrop of the field work that you're doing with your students that you start to think about the alignment of that field work with what you were doing in the classroom and the seminar component and the supervision component, and what the pedagogy should look like in light of what you're doing with clients. So let's dive into that article. For anyone who hasn't read it, I commend the piece to you. It's an excellent piece. For me, it was both refreshing, and it has challenged me, continues to challenge me to think more critically and deeply about what I do in clinic. So I want to just start off with the why. Why did you decide to write this piece right now in Clinical Law Review? What drove you to do that?
Let me say, Michael Pinar in his genius said I should. That's why.
That's great. And we had Michael on the first series.
It is, he said, I think you should. And who says no to Michael? So
right. That's great. Yeah. And in it, you give us this really important theoretical and normative frame for anti-racist clinical pedagogy. And it starts for me with the title, right? Freedom Pedagogy Toward Teaching Anti-Racist Clinics. And so I want to start by just unpacking some definitions. I think they're important to make sure that we're all on the same page. Like, what are we talking about here? What is freedom pedagogy? What is anti-racism? Why did you focus your ask from Michael Pinard on these topics?
Yeah. Okay. So I want to say he knew. Well, I could follow this up by connecting the last question, with your current question. Michael knew that I'd co-authored the Rutgers Law School anti-racism statement with two of my colleagues, Brandon Paradise and Kristen Andersma. I was not tenured then. Look, I mean, my tenure really just went through 2 weeks ago.
Congratulations on that too.
So I was not tenured then, but my dean, David Lopez, and a friend, thinks that you can do anything, thinks anyone can do anything. And having come from outside of academia, as I had, he came from the Department of Labor, had headed the department. He doesn't buy into our status all the time. So he's like,
yeah.
no, just do it. It's good. You should do it. But Michael knew that it had been very tough, right? It was very, very tough period in my professional life.
Yeah.
And, David and I are on the same page about status, but not everyone subscribed. I mean, it's dangerous. It was dangerous to do. It was dangerous to write. It came with, at professional costs, personal costs, and it was a very tough time.
Wow.
And getting it done was tough. And I'd been in like a group of people, Black clinicians, who were unpacking like what it was like to be in the law school right after George Floyd's murder. We were in like a kind of a roundtable session, a brown bag session, I forget, that Michael set up with Deborah Archer. And we were just talking about how difficult the times were, right?
Yeah.
And so they, Michael knew that it had been, and the statement ended up getting passed. And, I think the law school was proud of it, but the work it was so much work getting it done.
I can't imagine.
That, you wonder what comes next after just when you've had so much deep questioning of who you are as an institution, just to get this like zero step done. What comes next? And so Michael was like privy to all of the highs and the lows of that process for me personally. And so I'm really grateful for his recommendation to write it was cathartic in ways to write on this process in this way. So I start the article first with just talking about the process.
Right.
And the questions that it raised for an institution. And, so the title, as many of our titles come from at the back end, one of the questions that had been raised in our process was like, if we want to have an anti-racism requirement, won't the clinic satisfy it? Was one of the questions that came up in our process of deciding what we would do, what changes we would make as a law school. And so the thought was like, well, we have at least the clinics surely satisfy our anti-racism requirement.
Yeah.
And being a clinician, right? My thought on that was no, doesn't. Yeah. And to think that every clinician is anti-racist, that every clinic is anti-racist is presuming way too much. And, writing on that is, kind of just came out of that one of many questions that arose in the course of Rutgers trying to come to terms with not only the statement, but what we would do after the statement and a requirement. And so anti-racism, as we wanted to define it at the law school, was like to be anti-white supremacy.
Right.
And, you can start to lump a lot of things in. Well, are we, we're anti-hate generally, we're anti, we could be anti a lot of things and pro a lot of things, but what we were trying to do is center Blackness. And it's very difficult to center Blackness on a white faculty.
Right.
In a white institution, in a white state, in a white practice. And so how you go about doing that when you only have a couple of handfuls of Black faculty and some are on leave, and any given point in time, you might be, 2 or 3 might be lost to you. How do you center Blackness without adding so much work to Black people and Black students? And how do you guide that for a whole, for clinic writ large, clinicians all across the country? And we have more diversity than most, right? What I was finding is that most schools are like, oh, we don't even have that many Black faculty. We don't even have that many white. How do you center Blackness and not perpetuating anti-Blackness when you don't have people who are studied in race?
Right. Right. Yeah. And that is a critical question. I love that you start with this presumption of we can't, presume that clinic is anti-racist, right? That we have to challenge that assumption. And you not only challenge us in that, in critiquing ourselves, examining ourselves as to, are we anti-racist? Is what we're doing anti-racist? But you give us steps to get there, right? You give us a path forward, which I love the challenge and the gift of this framework that you've given in the piece, these 4 conceptual and concrete steps to creating an anti-racist clinic. And I'm going to list out all 4, and I just want to unpack all of them. You talked a bit about the first one, which was centering Blackness. That was the first step. And then there's mapping critical race theory onto clinical pedagogy, citing Black women. And then the last one I love, aligning with Black folks, organizing for the AfroFuture, where Black humanity is recognized and Black Lives Matters is more than an aspirational proposition. So I want to walk through each one just to give a sense. It's all fleshed out in the essay so beautifully, but I want to give folks here a sense of what all of that means, because it's so important. Each one is really important. And you started to talk a little bit about centering Blackness and how difficult that is. What actually does it look like when it's happening? What does it mean to center Blackness?
That's a great question. What does it look like? You know, I think maybe the answer to that, I would step back and say, why do people think that clinic is anti-racist?
Yeah, that's a good place to start.
It's because our clients are Black. You know, like it's just because our clients are Black, and that by serving Black people, you must be anti-racist, though we know that we're like perpetuating racism, even in the systems that we are, you know, having to take part in, right? And so I think centering Blackness requires us to name that these systems are anti-Black, that they're designed to perpetuate like a subclass of Black people. I mean, because I work in L&T, I just feel like it's such a stark example. Yeah. Everyone in there is Black. They're Black women. The
tenants, right?
Yeah, this is what gets us to like talking about, you know, citing Black women in a pedagogical sense. But all the tenants are Black women. The whole court's filled up with Black people, and it's set up to evict you, right? Even when there like are defenses and counterclaims in New Jersey, in particular in L&T, you can't raise counterclaims. It's a court of limited jurisdiction, so if you have counterclaims, you're supposed to take them elsewhere.
Wow.
And it makes it very difficult to be a full person in this place, right? And so I think, at least for me, starting to talk to my students about, like, let's just not act like this court isn't filled up with poor Black women.
Right.
And that the bench is filled with, you know, not poor white men. Right. And that they don't have time to listen to anything any of these people have to say. Like, the system is designed to not center you, Black woman, but to center me, white man, and my schedule in this court. And even now, right, the court has gotten worse in pandemic because our courts aren't open, it's on Zoom.
Right. Yeah.
The judge over the court spends 20 minutes talking about how you shouldn't be undressed, you shouldn't be, you know, you shouldn't be cooking for your child, you shouldn't be scrambling eggs, you should be,
my goodness.
I mean, the things that he says are so racist. And what are you supposed to do when your children are home? And why are you even having this court right now? You know, like, why are we
open? Right.
Why are we open? Why is it you don't have anything better to do? And I just, you know, so anyway, I just feel like I have to talk to my students about naming that, my colleagues and us naming this in this system that is designed really, like, we've normalized just evicting Black women.
Right. Right.
And we think that's okay.
Right. And you talk about bringing critical race theory, which you are also an expert in, into the clinical pedagogy space, which I think is so important, right? To give students a framework for it. Because I think we all can see with our eyes, we all know what's going on, but to give them a theoretical framework for what they're seeing so that they can understand it through an academic lens, right? That this is something that has been studied and theorized, and we have tools, mechanisms, right, through critical race theory to address it, right? One tenet of critical race theory that you suggest in the piece is to add to clinical pedagogy that I was struck by is the critique of liberalism and this idea that color blindness and rights-based analysis cannot resolve structural race problems. And in the piece you say, we should teach our students to pressure test ideas that center class instead of or in addition to race. And coming from a legal services background myself, I can very much relate to this idea of class being fronted as the real issue. Poverty, right, is the issue, and that masking a focus on race. Why should we pressure test ideas that center class instead of or in addition to race? Why should we teach our students that?
I'm learning so much from you, you know, already. When hearing you say these words is really important, because I'm like, oh, Tianna, that's so interesting.
These are your words. I'm speaking it back to you.
So interesting. So a couple of things. I want to say at that first conference, I met Sue Bryant, who I'm enamored with, and Jean Peters. I think they're goddesses of clinical legal.
They are.
You know?
I agree.
I think they're goddesses. The more I've learned so much from them, and I feel like I hope that this only builds on what they've done. You know, my partner is at CUNY, and in his orientation, Sue Bryant had a dinner at her house. I was like fangirling. I was just so excited to be going to Sue Bryant's apartment, which is beautiful.
That sounds so amazing.
It looked like it would be Sue Bryant's apartment. I was just so happy to be there. But I do think that some of this work, which I like grasped onto very early, again, because I was like really novice and didn't have my own ideas and just wanted to do a really good job at first, and was starting a new job in a new field in 3 months. I latched onto it without question. And what I think, and I teach it all the time. I teach it, and I love it. But I do feel like it stops short on some points about like who the student is, right? And who the client is, and that we could build on it by adding crit to it, right? So there, definitely. I just say I spent all that time to say like this is not a critique of what we have,
right? So
much as it's saying that we could take something else that we have that's out there and add to it in a way that will make it richer,
right?
And also for recognizing that most of our colleagues doing this work will be white. And most of our students will be white,
right?
At least for
That's just the demographics, right?
At least for the short term, that there be something that they can look to for help, right? Like not just your Black colleagues, but that there are people who have done years of very deep thought on these issues. And I find that critical race theory is one place, not the only place, that our other colleagues could look to start educating themselves from people, again, like, you know, well smarter than me and who have been thinking on this well longer than me. So when people say, where do I start? With Bell, with Crenshaw, this work's already been done. Add to Bryant and Jean Peters and others, and, you know, everyone here and all the work that we all put out, add Bell to that, add Crenshaw to that, add Harris to that, bring that into your syllabi, read it on the summer for yourself. That will help. And, you know, even beyond the law space, Kendi helps. You know, there are other places to look in the sociology space, but I just wanted to say that we can add to what we're doing, which is great. But we could, and for those who are saying, well, how do I do this? How do I center Blackness? How do I add race to my classes? That work's already been done.
Right.
And so I feel like that's just a place to start that doesn't say turn to your Black colleague and ask them for the answer.
Yeah. So what it sounds like to me is that the first three conceptual and concrete steps kind of go together in a lot of ways. So you're centering Blackness, you're putting critical race theory as a frame onto clinical pedagogy, and you're doing that by citing Black women, right? That all of those three things go together. And you just cited some Black women that we should be listening to, Bell Hooks, Kimberly Crenshaw, and others. And I know that you did a lot of hard work to what you call decolonize your syllabus and to really rethink who you were assigning your students to read. And that perhaps you weren't doing the work of anti-racism as it related to your syllabus, that was an awakening for you as you kind of examine that critically, kind of in the aftermath of this racial reckoning that the country, I don't know if it's gone or still here or where we are with that. But what was your process with that? I mean, you talk about these folks that you already were introduced to in large part with critical race theory, but I know that you found some new voices as well in your search. So what was that process like? Because a lot of folks, like you said, don't know where to start with that. And you've given us great people to start with, but after you did that kind of foundational work for yourself, what kind of led you to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing? How did that look?
Yeah, so I want to say that the first thing is you share syllabi, right? Which is great.
Yes.
So I'm sure what I did first was ask a lot of people for copies of their syllabus, right? And so we're perpetuating not thinking about this afresh and anew because we share syllabi. And I mean, look, it helps, but I think it keeps us using the same names and the same voices, and you know, we're then excluding some names and voices.
Yeah.
And so I think part of what the decolonizing means is you have to start fresh and go in search of what you want your clinic to stand for. And that's the additional work, right? Which takes time, and we are all very short on time.
Right.
And so I felt that
sometimes money too, right?
Yeah.
If you're talking about buying books and
the
reviewing
books,
them
right?
and all that.
And I've gotten so many book grants. So I talk about that in the paper, that I had the gift of many book grants. But all those things are also available in the library, even if it takes you a week to get it ILL, right? So it's there for you. So I had to look at myself and say, where did you get this? Why are you still using this many years in? And is this your brand, or is this someone else's brand? And do you even remember whose brand it is that you got this from, right? And so I had to start there. When I say cite Black women, though, I mean both professors and our clients, right? Like
it's important.
Their voices, centering them, citing them to the extent that it's comfortable for them to do so. I was in a talk yesterday at Harvard. They're doing work on that's, building on some work I did in a paper called Housing the Decarcerated. They're really led by women, like homeless women who have records. That's in great. A way that's quite, a model that we should be thinking of in their housing justice work. Like that part of your leadership team in your clinic is are Black women, right? Like that you are at your advisory council in your clinic, or if you don't serve Black women, if you serve Latino women, whoever you serve, that being advised, not just advising them, but being advised by them. So I mean, cite in the most broad sense. But yeah, I mean, I talk about evicted again, like you can just jump on things, Matthew Desmond, much respect to him, but there are Black women who write about housing too, and they did not
Including you.
get MacArthur.
You were saying you weren't even citing yourself, right?
Yeah,
On your syllabus.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I think the point is just a question. I just think the point is just to question our choices and not be doing copy and paste work, deciding who we are, what kind of lawyers we want our students to be, and asking ourselves, is our syllabus reflective of who we are and who we want our students to be as lawyers? And if it's not, what can we take out and add that will get us closer to what we are hoping for the end result to be in terms of, you know, identity forming? Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it's so important, right, to really ground students in that work through the seminar component, supervision component of clinic, so that they can actually do the field work, right? Go out and serve the community. And that is related to the last step that you gave us, aligning with Black folks, organizing for the AfroFuture, where Black humanity is recognized and Black Lives Matter is more than an aspirational proposition. So I want to read something again that you write in the piece. You say anti-racist clinics will not only work in the current status quo, but also will look to the future as Black people see it for themselves. So I want to unpack what that could look like. To me, it sounds like systemic reform, right? And there might be some folks on the line who focus on individual client representation in their clinics. And you talk about that a bit in the piece, that you can still do this work with individual clients as well. But what does it look like to be an ally for the AfroFuture? We might need to unpack first, what is the AfroFuture? And then what does it look like to be an ally with that?
And let me say, like, we can learn from, I don't want to say that it's only Black people who have these ideas. I learned so much about the AfroFuture from Caitlin Berry, who's at, I think Caitlin's at Villanova. Is Caitlin at Villanova? And she put me on to so many texts about the AfroFuture. So, you know, I just want to name that we just have to all be looking and exchanging ideas, which is why we need this conference back in person.
Yes.
So in Wendy Bach, after George Floyd murder, we had this virtual conference. We weren't going to have the conference, and we had the virtual conference. And Wendy Bach is such a mentor friend. And she said, what should we do? And I was just like, again, I was in the middle of this anti-racism thing with the school, with Rutgers, and Caitlin and Wendy, we were planning this conference, and Donna Lee, and people were just throwing ideas around. And the AfroFuture, I had been reading on the internet, and this is why, you know, I feel like we have to not silo ourselves into just talking to academics.
Right.
And I had been reading on the internet about the AfroFuture, and like Instagram and Twitter, and just trying to figure out what the young people were talking about as they were protesting in the movement, right? The movement was happening right in front of us, and I was at home and hadn't been out in months, and my kids, and I was trying to figure out, how do I tap into this movement from home with two small kids?
Right.
And so I was reading just what the younger people were writing, not just law folks, and the idea of the AfroFuture was just recurring.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know more about it. So I was reading again, I was talking to Wendy and Caitlin about this, and Caitlin had some sources, Walita's work, Adrienne Marie Brown's work. And so she was like, get these books. And I was reading these books. And, you know, I learned so much about what I think we should do from that. So these are not unique ideas, but I feel like we dismiss the ideas of the people on the ground as unrealistic, because our sense of realism is only the system in which we practice right now. There doesn't need to be L&T court. And I think what pandemic gave us, like, let's think about the criminal system. I know Vita wrote, when court was closed, like, DC is not burning with us not putting, like, sending all of these Black men to jail every day, and having court every day, sending all these Black men to jail. DC is just fine. And I love that Vita wrote that, Vita Johnson at Georgetown, like, when she posted that, even though, you know, this doesn't have to be You know, right now I would say everybody at my kids' school gets free lunch.
Right.
Right.
Because
like,
of the pandemic.
It used to be like all this whole thing, like stigma around free lunch. All the mamas want free lunch. All the daddies want free lunch. Everybody's getting free lunch.
Yes.
It's a change in a system. We've just like seen a space where we could change all these systems. There's no stigma about it because everybody's parent is like, yeah, go get that. Then there's advocacy for better free lunch, right? Because everybody's getting it.
Right.
And so I just use it as a basic example about like, so the AfroFuture looks at like getting rid of all of this and saying, what does it look like to not have all these systems designed to like undo Black folks' humanity?
Right.
And L&T Court is one of those systems. I think we just saw in pandemic what it looks like. ERAP should stay. I know the White House is looking into that. Like emergency rental assistance program is something that we need and we could do.
Right.
And when the pandemic was in full force, eviction court was closed.
Yeah.
ERAP was a thing. That's it. It's not that difficult.
And it didn't have the same barriers that sometimes it has.
We don't need this. We spend all this money and time and energy evicting people, and our country is too rich for that. We don't have to do that. So in each of our fields, we could look at ways in which this whole thing doesn't have to operate like this. And it's not only, it's a public health necessity always to be housed.
Right.
Like even when Corona ends, whenever that is, it's always a public health crisis to have this many homeless and almost homeless people.
Definitely.
So, I mean, I think we've got an opportunity here, and we've already started to experience what it could be like for people to say, hey, I lost my job, I can't pay my rent, and fill out a form, and the government take care of that. Why can't that be the new way? And I
wholeheartedly agree.
Systems, the people that we pay right now to process evictions can process ERAP.
Right.
No one has
There's still the
leave their
administrative
job. Like there's
tasks
still work
involved.
to do,
Right.
Because people are so worried about their jobs. Like all these people can process ERAP.
Right. Right. Well, thank you, Norrinda. I mean, I enjoy this segment of us in conversation. I do want to open it up. I know that there are likely people in the audience that have been waiting for their turn to ask a question of you, and I have many more. So if we hit a lull, I'm happy to jump in, but I want to give others an opportunity. And I'll monitor the chat as well if you feel more comfortable putting your question there. But just go ahead and unmute, type in the chat, however you want to chime in. Professor Britton.
Hello, Norrinda.
Hi.
So good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Norrinda, you were involved in a well-publicized verbal attack from your neighbor. And you essentially came out and stood your ground. Has that incident factored into any of your teaching and any referral to it since the incident?
I don't think so. I mean, so this was all at the same time. Like I was writing a statement and this happened and George Floyd was murdered and everyone was at home. This was all at the same time, but it was, what happened there is more my old school teaching. I guess I've always been teaching that because neighbors pushing against white neighbors pushing against Black neighbors is kind of what I spent my career at the department doing, right? It's so old school as to be shocking that it could still be happening in the way that it does. So I feel like that was probably always where my teaching was, that this is, conduct that we need to push against. I would say most of my teaching is directed at poor people of color, poor Black women. And so my resources, both in the town that I live in, the police department that is in that town, how they're trained to respond to people who live in that town and live in houses like mine and drive cars like me, makes that incident, I think, less applicable to what I teach because of my privilege. And I guess this goes to Tianna's question about how we have to disaggregate class issues and race issues, and it's tied together, and then it's not. I see that my privilege is part of what prevented that from escalating in a way. Both my privilege to live in Montclair, my privilege to live, to be a professor at the law school, to make calls, to say things to, people in charge in town. So I feel like it's less applicable to my teaching because the folks that we represent are so devoid of privilege that I don't feel like even my racist incidents directed at me still, in my view, do not compare to the lives and systems that my clients have to live. And so I've tried not to talk about it at work, because I think that it is less directly relevant to what we're trying to achieve. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Norrinda. Any other questions?
So I had a question, Norrinda, which is, Tianna and I touched base on questions, but this is definitely one I had too, is that we're seeing the ABA kind of shift and start to talk more directly about these issues, and this whole standard 303 being revised and requiring us explicitly to provide education to students on bias, cross-cultural competence, and racism, right? At 2 points in the student's legal career, and one being kind of at the beginning, and then one another time before graduation. And so I'm just wondering if you have any reactions to those changes. Like, does that bring us any closer to freedom pedagogy, to anti-racist pedagogy? And also one big concern I had was, how do we ensure that what we're doing is actually meaningful and not just more box checking? Yeah. I don't know if you had any thoughts or reactions in response.
Yeah. I think our hiring practices are going to have to change in order to get there. I'm not sure what the ABA thinks is going to happen and how that's going to happen with what we have right now, right? Like, I would say in our faculty, academic freedom has been raised as part of the challenge to getting people to incorporate all these topics into all their classes, right? And so to the extent that we, and I believe in academic freedom, but I feel like we're at a impasse. Who is to teach these courses?
Mm-hmm, right.
Who is to teach them? How are they to be taught? And there are levels to racism among faculties, right? And you can't put this work on people who are already oppressed, right? So I just said, I do have a privilege, I have a level of privilege. That privilege has its limits as a Black woman in America. And I don't think that we can expect all this work to be done by Black women on faculties, right? And so I'm just not sure. I'm really unsure of how we get all this done, even though I think it's a laudable objective with, people not knowing how to teach it, not wanting to teach it. That's the worst thing, is to try to force someone who doesn't want to teach it.
Right.
I don't know, they're both bad. Someone who wants to teach it but doesn't know how is also very bad.
Yeah.
But we can work with it, right? We're going to have to beef up our professional development inside of our institutions and really make a deep commitment to that. So we have those people who want to, but don't know how, and we have to cure for that with re-educating ourselves. And that's difficult for law professors to agree to re-educate ourselves, right? We know everything already. And so, and then you have people who don't want to teach it and don't believe it should be taught. Like it's like, don't want to teach it, don't believe it should be taught. What are we going to do with those members of the faculty? We also have students who don't think it should be taught or don't think they should have to learn. And I don't think the ABA rule addresses that, which is another reason we shouldn't just have Black women teaching it. Our evaluations are already an issue. And when you lob it, this kind of work that it just on a certain group of people who already face bias, again, as I'm saying, like having the oppressed do all the work is difficult. And that will also lend itself to, promotion and retention issues of these folks. So I think it's really multi-layered how we're going to get to actually actualizing that requirement in a way that is equitable and fair and feels freeing and like progress and not more replication of troubling dynamics among our faculty, which is, our statement tried to talk about how we recruit students, how we recruit faculty, the employers that we deal with, the internship and externship providers that we deal with. We have to look at all of this kind of top to bottom in order to get to the right answers.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to take moderator's privilege for a moment and just end with the final question here. I was just taken by the speech that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson gave after being confirmed as our next United States Supreme Court Justice. She quoted Dr. Maya Angelou, "I am the dream and the hope of the slave." And that gets me back to this idea of the Afro-future. And what are Black people dreaming about? What are we hoping about? Are our dreams and hopes big enough? This idea that the slaves dreamed that it could be possible to have a U.S. Supreme Court justice, right, is really striking to me. And so I just want to end, just as we have like a minute left. What are you dreaming and hoping for, Black woman Norrinda Hayat?
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you again for this conversation. I was reading Black Reconstruction last night for this paper that I'm working on, and it reminded me that the slave dreams were to have equal rights with white people, right? And that we already knew that's like the Freedmen's Bureau's work. Thaddeus Stevens was out here like saying this needed to be the case, and others. We still have not gotten there. So I don't think that the Black people's dream is really different than anyone else's dream.
Right.
Is to be free. And the paper I'm writing on is about what pandemic looked like in Black communities versus in white communities, and like what freedom even in pandemic looked like in Black communities versus white communities, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really equal rights to do as you please, to do as you please, which is not foreign. Everyone else understands that because everyone else really, where white folks live with that freedom. And so it's just extending it to do whatever you want, whenever you want, how you want to do it, instead of being, so limited. And so,
yeah, right. How can we flourish? Yeah, I love that.
Right.
Love that.
Like allowing you to be a full human person living in America is what I think the outer bounds of the freedom are. And then everyone does that for themselves, makes those own those choices for themselves of what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. But I would start with like, if we could just get equal freedom.
Right.
On par with what is called for in the Constitution, that would allow for the Afro-future.
Well, thank you so much, Norrinda, for sharing
Thank you
all of your wisdom
I
with
know
us.
it's late in the semester.
Nah,
Good to see you all. Thank
you
you
are
for
a
taking the
gift. You are
time.
a gift to the clinical community, to academia more generally. I just love that we were able to spend this time together, talking about anti-racism, centering Blackness, clinical pedagogy. It's been a joy. So thank you. Thank you all for joining us, everyone who's attended. I'll turn things back over to Lindsay to give some parting words before we conclude.
Sure, just very quickly, if anyone would like to hop on and do a video picture together and say cheese, we're going to do that. So put your video on, and when I'm done talking, we'll take a quick pic if you would like to capture this moment. Because sometimes if we don't, it's like it didn't happen somehow, especially on Zoom for me. So today's conversation was recorded. We'll make it available on our website if you want to share it with anybody else who's maybe interested in this topic or couldn't make it today. You're all fixing your hair while I'm talking. I love it. And we will plan to re-engage with you all in the fall. We'll keep doing this, the conversations with clinicians, and address topics like these and more. We could spend a lot more sessions on this topic in particular. So thank you, Norrinda and Tianna, for kicking us off. Last thing I'll say is many of you know that our predecessor law school and then DC School of Law was founded 50 years ago. So we're celebrating our 50-year anniversary right now. And our folks in our development office would love me to tell you that we have this 50 for 50 pledge. It's actually 50 minutes of pro bono. I've been saying 50 hours. It's 50 minutes of pro bono time and $50 if you'd like to contribute to this effort to kind of celebrate this moment in UDC history. So I'll put the link in the chat, and then we'll take a picture right now. Maybe Andy, you can count us off 1, 2, 3, because he's going to help me take the picture. Andy Budzinski with our general practice clinic. Tianna is a wonderful co-teacher. So we'll do 1, 2, 3, pick. Oh, yeah, we have family joining the pick.
Yeah.
All right, here we go.
Okay.
So 1, 2, 3. I took a couple.
Awesome.
Okay, thanks,
Thank you
Andy.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for
Thank you,
joining us. And
everybody.
Norrinda, thank you for your time. Nobody mentioned this, but Norrinda's actually like not even at home or in her office right now. She's at a conference at NYU. She's at the Ludi Lytle conference, conference. So she's really making special arrangements. She's in Deborah Archer's office right now. So thank you, Norrinda. Thank you, Tianna, for doing
Thank you. This was
All
a pleasure.
Bye.
Take care.
Okay, goodbye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.